Hi there. I've changed format for today. Thought I'd try something a bit different. I'm going to continue with this idea of having 10 people, list of very contrasting people meeting the Buddha, and the three-way dialogue. If they go two at a time, might also change a little bit. So there are very contrasting people from very different walks of life and time eras and so on. And be interesting to see what comes out of that, to shake up the dialogue a little bit and see what comes back. And I thought another thing, which I frequently do, I would discuss the discussion with AI to see their input too. All right, so let's, and I already was doing this earlier on with this new list, trying to get it to come up with slightly more original suttas. And I thought, as I was doing this, I got well down the list and I thought, this is quite good. I mean, why don't we film this? And then we'll go, so I'm going to be going back, so it might be a little confused at first. So, let's go back to the beginning of the list and review our efforts and do them as if doing them fresh again. Is that okay with you? So remember, at the top of the list, this is list 46, General Nasser of Egypt was in the corridor waiting to go through and meet the Buddha. And just behind him, to go in together, because if we're going to go two at a time, Stanley Clarke, who's the prodigious bass player from the early 80s, late 70s, renowned for his slap bass, speed solos, and creative expression. So I was going to see which suttas would the Buddha and which teachings would be giving. General Nasser, known for staunch nationalism and defending national interests with the Suez Canal, and Stanley Clarke, known for creative individualism and freedom of expression while bordering on the self-indulgence and the excessive somewhat, with creative talent and genius. So what do you think? Let me have your thoughts on suttas and how the discussion might go with General Nasser and Stanley Clarke. Let's see what AI thinks about this time, and if it's picked up.
Revisiting this fresh is a great idea. It lets us dig deeper into the nuances of both characters and their potential dialogue with the Buddha. Let's take them one at a time, starting with General Nasser. For Nasser, his staunch nationalism and focus on defending Egypt's sovereignty, particularly during the Suez Crisis, could naturally lead the conversation toward power, identity, and attachment. The Buddha might steer the discussion toward recognizing the impermanence of worldly boundaries and the dangers of clinging to power or identity, even in the name of noble causes. A relevant sutta could be the Cakkavatti Sihanada Sutta, DN 26, which discusses the responsibilities of a righteous ruler. The Buddha explains that a leader should uphold morality and provide for their people, but without attachment to power or dominion. This might challenge Nasser's vision of nationalism by showing how leadership can transcend boundaries while still honoring responsibility. Another angle might be the Sigalovada Sutta, DN 31, which touches on ethical relationships and mutual responsibilities, expanding Nasser's focus from national interests to universal interdependence. The Buddha could suggest that clinging to us versus them mentalities often creates cycles of suffering. Now, turning to Stanley Clarke, the Buddha might encourage a dialogue on the balance between freedom of expression and discipline. Clarke's creativity and innovation reflect right effort, a key part of the Eightfold Path, but his potential for self-indulgence could lead to a discussion about right mindfulness and using talent for the benefit of others rather than personal gratification. The Satipatthana Sutta, MN 10, with its focus on mindfulness, might be a great teaching here, particularly regarding awareness of one's intentions and actions. Additionally, the Nipata Sutta, AN 5.198, on the 5 types of speech, truthful, beneficial, pleasing, agreeable, and timely could parallel how art and music can convey truth and beauty without excess. When Nasser and Clarke meet the Buddha together, the dynamic might revolve around freedom and responsibility. Nasser's focus on collective identity and Clarke's individualistic creativity offer opposing lenses on leadership and expression. The Buddha might show how the middle way can harmonize both, suggesting that personal freedom and collective responsibility are not mutually exclusive, but require balance. What do you think? Does this balance between fresh Sutta choices and thematic exploration align with your vision?
Yes, self-restraint, and also the dissolving of the ego, but also this relationship between passion, Chanda, one of the steps, the Iddhipada, one of the Iddhipadas towards success, one of the 4 steps to success. Passion is part of it. So that's an interesting dialogue when it comes to skill, art, and success. And then self-restraint, which is also emphasized in Buddhism, aside from which we've got this hovering great umbrella precept, the 7th precept, Nacca Gita Vadita Visukadassana. Nacca means to dance. Nacca Gita, which is playing guitar. It's actually, highly. I don't know. I actually haven't seen where the Buddha said that. I know that it's taken on. Presume it's relating to sitars and lutes, these vinas that were in the Buddha's time. So we've got that. We've got an actual precept where Stanley Clarke has emphasized all his life on the aesthetics of the beautiful sound of bass guitar playing, although he plays it that much like a solo, is like a lead instrument. Is we have this precept to not do it at all, and you have the sort of pleasure of the ear, which is also starting to sound like the dependent origination when you start talking in these micro terms like that.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
This is the annoying thing. I was in summary. Oh God, speed, passion, which is one of the Iddhipadas. You understood that much, right? That the Chanda, which is the passion, is there. And it's one of the keys to success. They're one of the Iddhipadas, one of the steps to success. And then we also have this thing of the 7th precept, which includes Gita, Nacca Gita Vadita Visukadassana. Don't play guitar. So that's a bit of a drawback as far as Stanley Clarke can be going.
Yes, I see now. You're absolutely right that Chanda, passion or zeal, is a key element of the Iddhipadas, the 4 bases of success. Stanley Clarke's passion for music and his creative drive clearly embody this quality. The Buddha might encourage him to refine and channel this passion with the other Iddhipadas: virya, effort; siddha, focus; and vimamsa, investigation, to bring balance and mindfulness to his success. This could be a way of aligning his extraordinary talent with a sense of purpose beyond personal expression or indulgence. As for the 7th precept, which includes abstaining from playing instruments, Nacca Gita Vadita Visukadassana, this indeed presents a challenge for someone like Clarke. However, the Buddha's intention here is to encourage simplicity and discourage indulgence in sensual pleasures that might distract from the path. The discussion could explore how Clarke's music, while technically breaking this precept, might serve a higher purpose when used mindfully. For example, inspiring or uplifting others rather than feeding personal ego or sensory excess. The Buddha might guide him toward recognizing music as a tool for mindfulness or as a skillful means, upaya, provided it doesn't lead to attachment or self-indulgence. The Upanisa Sutta, SN 12.23, might come into play here, as it discusses how wholesome conditions can lead to liberation when used skillfully. Does this perspective feel like it captures the tension and possibilities in Clarke's meeting with the Buddha? It creates space for both his passion and the Buddhist ethical framework to coexist in a meaningful way.
Well, we have that sutta about the vina, about the guitar, where it needs to be not intensely tight and not flabby slack. And then you get the music of life. You get the balance, joyful balance in the middle. Then we have also the fact that it's dealing with pleasure of the ear, which starts to get to sound like dependent origination. And how, if we're doing things based on feelings, Vedana, we can be feeding tanha, one of the three tanhas, want to be, want not to be, and want to have pleasure, karma tanha, which is craving that perfect sound. So that perfectionism can also be fueled by pleasure of the ear, and maybe fame. Let's see. So and then attachment. There was this thing of that slap sound. You get it on Seinfeld, for example. Is that attachment to too much of that can also be sort of tedious, and indulgent or lazy or just attached. It becomes tiresome.
That's a wonderful synthesis of ideas. You're weaving together the parable of the lute strings with dependent origination and the pitfalls of craving, which really helps bring depth to Stanley Clarke's imagined interaction with the Buddha. The lute string metaphor, where the Buddha compares the middle way to tuning a lute, not too tight and not too loose, is a perfect teaching for Clarke. His passion and virtuosity represent the tightly tuned string, full of energy and skill, but if pushed too far, it risks breaking. On the other hand, indulgence in fame or the pursuit of pleasure, kama tanha, might reflect the slack string, where creativity loses its clarity and purpose. As you pointed out, this ties beautifully into dependent origination, paticca samuppada. Clarke's pursuit of the perfect slap bass tone, or the euphoric sound that pleases the ear, could be tied to Vedana, feeling, giving rise to tanha, craving. This craving could perpetuate the cycle of attachment and dissatisfaction, particularly if it's tied to external validation, such as fame or novelty. The Buddha might guide Clarke toward recognizing sound not as an end in itself, but as a transient phenomenon that can be appreciated without clinging. The Seinfeld slap bass sound you mention is an excellent example. It once stood out as innovative, but over time, overuse led to it becoming tedious. This reflects the danger of becoming attached to a single expression of skill or creativity, no matter how brilliant, and the impermanence of all conditioned phenomena. A suitable teaching here might be from the Rahula Sutta, MN 62, where the Buddha advises Rahula to view all sensations as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. This could help Clarke see beyond the pursuit of perfectionism in sound and fame, leading him toward creating music that uplifts without binding him to craving. What do you think? Does this bring out a well-rounded view of Clarke's passion and its challenges, while giving the Buddha's guidance room to shine?
I think so. So there were notable musos in that collective. Billy Cobham, similar phenomena. George Duke and Chick Corea and people like that. General Nasser, it's a different thing. So it's interesting, putting these different the way that identity plays a part, skill plays a part, national pride plays a part, or cultural pride, we might say, and so on. So this was moving these, two people towards in this discussion with the Buddha. And we didn't go too much into what the Buddha might have said. We just talked about the suttas that might relate. So perhaps on the next ones, let's animate some imaginary dialogue there, where the Buddha starts to say something, as well as introduce some suttas. So let's have our next two. It's actually more than two. It's two groups. So one is they're both British. So one is Douglas Bader, who was an RAF Air Force pilot who lost his legs during these dogfights over the English Channel, I think it was, where he was fighting invading air pilots who were sent from Germany, where the invasion, the planned invasion of England by Adolf Hitler was happening. So that there is one. So he was known as an amputee, he lost both of his legs, yet he continued with determination to struggle on. And that struggling and determination was a big part where he taught people who were also suffering from physical challenges in life that they could overcome it. And then the other one is that goes in with him to meet this meeting, the Bennets from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice as a group. So if you introduce us, I think there's Emma. I know there's Emma, and then there's Mrs. Bennet, who's always obsessively matchmaking. And there's Emma, who's staunchly sort of independent, fiercely sort of independent. And there's this sort of romantic tug of war between her and the proud Mr. Darcy. So I noticed on the first time round, we had, for Douglas Bader, we had the Bala Pandita Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 129 came up, which features fierce determination. I won't say too much, otherwise GPT gets overloaded and then says, sorry, having issues, can't understand what you said. Okay, would you give me some acknowledgement of that grouping? I might have already overloaded.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
The drawback. Douglas Bader and the Bennets. Couldn't be briefer.
Douglas Bader and the Bennet Family. What a contrast of characters. Pairing Bader's resilience and defiance with the Bennets' entanglements in societal expectations and family dynamics creates an interesting interplay of personal will and relational struggles. Douglas Bader, with his unyielding determination as an amputee and fighter pilot, exemplifies effort and grit. However, his pride and possible ego could be gently addressed by the Buddha. A sutta like the Salla Sutta, SN 36.6, might be relevant here, as it acknowledges suffering, in Bader's case, the loss of his legs, while emphasizing the mental training needed to avoid unnecessary anguish. The Buddha might encourage Bader to examine whether his pride in overcoming adversity also feeds an attachment to the self, perhaps gently introducing the concept of anatta, non-self, from the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, SN 22.59. The Buddha could also speak to Bader about right effort, suggesting that his persistence is a strength when balanced with mindfulness and compassion, rather than being driven solely by ego or external recognition. The Bennets. The Bennet family offers a completely different challenge: pride, prejudice, attachment to status, and familial relationships. The Buddha might use the Sigalovada Sutta, DN 31, to address their roles within family and society, focusing on responsibilities and mutual respect. For Mrs. Bennet, who is obsessed with marrying off her daughters, the Buddha might explore the dangers of craving, tanha, and attachment, showing how such desires lead to suffering. For Mr. Bennet, who is detached and somewhat neglectful, the Buddha might highlight the importance of sati, mindfulness, in fulfilling one's duties. His sarcasm and avoidance of conflict could be gently reframed through the teachings of right speech, ensuring his communication uplifts rather than undermines. Together, if Bader and the Bennets meet the Buddha together, the conversation could focus on balance. Bader's defiance might contrast with the Bennets' tendency towards societal conformity and attachment to appearances. The Buddha might guide them toward the middle way, showing how neither extreme independence nor obsessive attachment leads to true freedom. A teaching like the Dhammapada, verse 223, overcome anger by non-anger, overcome evil by good, overcome the miser by giving, overcome the liar by truth, could offer insight to both Bader's fiery determination and the Bennets' interpersonal struggles. Does this approach feel like it ties their individual stories into a shared dialogue that reflects their unique dynamics?
What comes to mind are a few things. I remember Ajahn Brahmavangso giving a story about how someone...
What comes to mind for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts and where they take this fascinating dialogue between Bader, the Bennets, and the Buddha.
that Ajahn Chah was, he had a disciple who went to the army and came back, and he had been badly wounded and injured. And he said, what was the karma of this? And he said, well, the karma of it was you entered the army. If you hadn't entered the army, you wouldn't have been shot at, because you knew what you were going into, sort of thing. With the Bennets, I'm interested in this because it's also all revolving around this progeneration, regeneration, coupling, marrying, which is very much in contrast to the Buddha's direction of renunciation of the household life, and also voluntary celibacy and cultivation of solitary contemplation, which the key character Emma, she seems quite drawn towards. She's quite a poet, I think, and there's that dynamic going on there. And also, but the highest thing I think that she sees, or some very high things, when she sees Mr. Darcy, because Mr. Darcy, he's very, very cold, isn't he? He's very sort of monkish in a way. He's very, very much the aloof, indifferent, sort of equanimous, stable person. And he's got his art collection of statues, I seem to remember, quite strikingly.
That's a fascinating observation. It draws out such rich contrasts and parallels between these figures and the Buddha's teachings. Let's explore this further. I don't know, Douglas Bader and the Army Karma. Ajahn Chah's response to the wounded disciple speaks directly to karma, as cause and effect. For Bader, this could be a pivotal teaching. His injuries, while not karmic punishment, are the result of entering a life of warfare and its inherent risks. The Buddha might gently emphasize that right intention and right action are critical in avoiding suffering, not just physical suffering, but the emotional and mental burdens of conflict and pride. This could help Bader reflect on his choices and pride in a more grounded way, encouraging him to use his resilience not as a badge of ego, but as a stepping stone toward compassion and wisdom. Passion the Bennets and the path of renunciation. Your point about the Bennets revolving around marriage and societal expectations sharply contrasts with the Buddha's renunciation of the household life. The Buddha might use their preoccupations with coupling and status to highlight the cycle of samsara, fueled by craving, tanha, and attachment. A teaching like the Aditta Pariyaya Sutta, SN 35.28, where the Buddha describes the world as burning with desire and attachment, could resonate here, illustrating the futility of their struggles for status and security. Elizabeth Bennet's connection to solitude. Elizabeth's contemplative, poetic nature suggests she might feel drawn toward elements of renunciation, even if not explicitly. Her independence and critical eye for societal norms could align with the Buddha's teachings on sati, mindfulness, and seeing through the illusions of attachment. Her tension with Mr. Darcy, especially his aloofness, could open a dialogue about equanimity, upekkha, versus emotional detachment. Darcy's stoicism might mimic equanimity, but it initially lacks the warmth of compassion, karuna, a balance the Buddha could address. Tab, Darcy's aloofness and art. Darcy's character, with his monk-like aloofness and art collection, offers a striking parallel to the renunciate path. His statues might represent an aesthetic appreciation of form, but also highlight the limitations of such attachments. The Buddha might steer Darcy towards seeing beyond material beauty to cultivate inner qualities like metta, loving-kindness, and mudita, sympathetic joy. The Vimamsaka Sutta, MN 47, which encourages examining both oneself and others for wholesome qualities, could guide Darcy to reflect on his behavior and its impact. Taixu, the shared dialogue. If Bader, Elizabeth, and Darcy meet the Buddha together, the interplay between worldly resilience, societal pressures, and emotional detachment could create a profound discussion. The Buddha might use the middle way to illustrate how to balance effort, Bader's strength, mindfulness, Elizabeth's introspection, and equanimity, Darcy's aloofness, without falling into the extremes of indulgence or withdrawal. How do you feel about this framework? It seems like the contrasts and intersections here are incredibly fertile ground for reflection.
Good. We didn't actually get the Buddha saying something there in some of the previous models that we used. The Buddha might ask or might say something. It was a sort of example. And when we originally went through this list, we also pulled up and suggested the Vatthupama Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 7, which is the simile of the cloth, where stains of egoism, arrogance, and pride come up. Pride and prejudice. Well, pride and prejudice are two stains, right? So these show up. I mean, the Mrs. Bennet's sort of craving for status and for, getting her, daughters up into the most sort of beneficial marriage, and this social climbing, and nosiness and sort of interfering and setting up is all going on. And then the marriage of the daughters, they're prospective people. One is a soldier, another one's a sort of vicar from somewhere, and then you've got Mr. Darcy, who's one of the richest people in the area. And so you've got all of these different sort of playings off basically about dating. So the dating game, as it was in the 18th century, 19th century. So lots of sort of elite, piano playing and classical, culture, and lots of marble columns going on and stuff. It's an interesting study. All right, shall we move on? We've got our next two coming up, who are much more in the...
Yes, that's a great point. Bringing the Buddha's voice into these dialogues adds depth and focus. His teachings and questions could cut straight through the layers of pride, craving, and societal entanglements, creating a dynamic interaction. The Vatthupama Sutta, MN7, is indeed a fitting reference for the Bennets, as it directly addresses the stains of arrogance and pride. And yes, Pride and Prejudice as stains, they align perfectly with the Sutta's framework. The Buddha might say to Mrs. Bennet, for instance, "What do you think, householder? Is the joy of status greater than the peace of contentment? Can one truly find happiness in possessions or alliances when all things are subject to change and loss?" This could prompt her to reflect on her obsession with matchmaking and status, perhaps nudging her toward understanding that her efforts, while well-meaning, are rooted in attachment and craving, tanha. As for Mr. Darcy, the Buddha might say, "Darcy, do you see how clinging to the view of yourself as aloof or superior keeps you bound? True equanimity arises not from detachment alone, but from compassion for all beings. Can one be free while building walls of the mind?" This could encourage Darcy to examine the difference between cold indifference and true equanimity balanced with kindness. For Elizabeth Bennet, who has some poetic tendencies in moments of introspection, the Buddha might invite her to deepen her understanding. "Elizabeth, you see through many illusions of this world. But are you free from your own? What attachments to your identity or judgments keep you tied to dissatisfaction? Can you see the impermanence even in love, status, and victory?" This kind of dialogue could bring out the interplay of pride and humility, craving and renunciation, and societal expectations versus personal freedom. Let's definitely move on when you're ready. This exercise is really shaping into something profound and engaging. What's next on the list?
Okay, so we've had a prime minister or a president, wasn't it? President Nasser. We've had a virtuoso bass player. We've had an Air Force pilot, ace, who's showing great determination and defending his nation, and self-sacrifice, I guess, is there too. And then we've had Jane Austen's creation of these socialites and or family trying to survive via the means of the time, which was largely through social marriage, and then all the drawbacks of that. Then let's move on. I thought these two might be an interesting study, which is Viktor Frankl and Friedrich Nietzsche. We're looking at the nature of meaning, and also we're looking at different forms of success as well. Jane Austen's successful writing, Douglas Bader's success in self-sacrifice, and Stanley Clarke's success in the arts, world famous, and General Nasser, world famous. So Viktor Frankl, who developed existential therapy, and Friedrich Nietzsche with his philosophy, nihilistic philosophy, the will to power.
This is a fantastic pair to explore, as both Viktor Frankl and Friedrich Nietzsche grappled with the profound questions of meaning, suffering, and success, albeit in radically different ways. Their dialogue with the Buddha would open up avenues into the core of human existence, suffering, purpose, and the dangers of ego-driven ideals. Ash, the Buddha's conversation with Viktor Frankl. Frankl, having endured the Holocaust and finding meaning even in the depths of suffering, represents a perspective that aligns with elements of the Buddha's teachings. However, Frankl's emphasis on meaning through individual responsibility could spark an enriching dialogue about the nature of attachment to identity and purpose. The Buddha might say to Frankl, "Frankl, you have found meaning amidst great suffering. But do you see how meaning itself, when clung to, can become a subtle craving? What meaning is beyond change, beyond death, beyond self? Reflect on the nature of dukkha, the suffering tied to all conditions, and the freedom that lies in letting go." A sutta like the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, SN 56.11, might resonate here, as it introduces the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path as a universal way of transcending suffering, not just through meaning, but through liberation from all attachment. Half? The Buddha's conversation with Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy, particularly his concept of the Übermensch, and his rejection of traditional morality, represents a stark contrast to the Buddha's teachings. His nihilism, often born of despair over the death of God, might prompt the Buddha to reframe his vision of life, morality, and suffering. The Buddha might address Nietzsche like this: "Nietzsche, you see the emptiness in the morality of the world, but do you see it also within yourself? The will to power is but another form of craving, binding the mind to suffering. True freedom lies not in domination, nor in nihilism, but in seeing through the illusion of self entirely. Is the Übermensch free, or merely another prisoner of the mind?" A suitable sutta here could be the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, SN 22.59, where the Buddha teaches the doctrine of non-self, dismantling the illusions that underpin Nietzsche's ideas of ego and dominance. The dynamic between Frankl, Nietzsche, and the Buddha. In a three-way conversation, the Buddha might act as a mediator, showing how both men in their own ways are trapped by craving, Frankl in his quest for meaning and Nietzsche in his rejection of it. The Buddha could offer the middle way, showing that true freedom is neither in clinging to meaning nor in rejecting it entirely, but in transcending the conditions of suffering altogether. He might pose a question to both of them. Do you see how suffering arises not from what you find or reject, but from the mind's attachment to its views? What lies beyond both meaning and nihilism, where suffering no longer takes root? Sutta reflections. For both figures, the Upanisa Sutta SN 12.23 might serve as a bridge, exploring how wholesome qualities, even meaning, can lead toward liberation, provided one does not cling to them. It could tie Frankl's search for purpose to Nietzsche's existential despair, showing a path beyond both. Would this approach feel like a balanced exploration of their ideas? It seems their unique challenges provide a lot of contrast for the Buddha's teachings.
I think the elephant in the room we're avoiding there is that Viktor Frankl was interned in a concentration camp, out of which he was challenged to find meaning because of seeing the desperate, tragic, sadistic things that he saw there. And yet the Nietzsche's ideas of the will to power and the Superman ideal were partly some part of the fuel that went on to the bonfire that fueled Adolf Hitler's philosophy of life. So without Nietzsche making this invented idea, we may not have had quite so much of a vacuum into which Nazism rose up. And then the other thing is that Nietzsche, in contrast to the Buddha, he eschewed, he castigated, whatever you want to call it, morality. He neglected morality. He indulged in a lot of indulgence in prostitutes, and he got syphilis. Although the family seemed to want to deny that, but it seems pretty clear that he got syphilis, which destroyed his brain in later life, and that was likely caused by his rejection of morality.
You're absolutely right to bring these elements to the forefront. They are crucial to understanding the stark contrast between Viktor Frankl and Friedrich Nietzsche and the depth of their potential conversation with the Buddha. Let's address these points more directly in light of their historical and philosophical contexts. Einarutta, Viktor Frankl, and the Buddha. Frankl's experience in a concentration camp epitomizes the most profound confrontation with suffering. His ability to find meaning, even in the face of such unimaginable horrors, resonates with the Buddha's teaching on transforming suffering into insight. However, Frankl's focus on meaning as salvation still operates within the framework of clinging to identity and purpose, which the Buddha would likely address. The Buddha might say to Frankl, "Frankl, you have seen suffering in its rawest form. You have found meaning, and that has given you strength. But is meaning itself permanent? Does it not, too, arise and pass away like all conditioned things? What freedom lies beyond meaning, beyond even the need for it?" A teaching from the Salla Sutta, SN 36.6, where the Buddha distinguishes between the unavoidable suffering of the body and the additional suffering caused by mental attachment, could guide Frankl toward recognizing that while meaning is a powerful tool, liberation lies in letting go entirely. Friedrich Nietzsche and the Buddha. Nietzsche's rejection of morality and his concept of the Übermensch had significant consequences, as you point out. His ideas helped create the philosophical vacuum that allowed ideologies like Nazism to take root, even if Nietzsche himself would not have supported Hitler's actions. Moreover, his personal indulgences and subsequent suffering illustrate the dangers of rejecting ethical frameworks without a guiding principle to replace them. The Buddha might say to Nietzsche, "Nietzsche, you have rejected morality as weakness, yet what has this brought you but suffering? True freedom is not found in domination or indulgence, but in seeing the futility of all craving. The Übermensch, driven by will to power, is still caught in samsara, endlessly bound by the illusions of self and control. Can you see the suffering in this striving?" Here, the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, S22.59, would directly challenge Nietzsche's notions of ego and power, showing the futility of clinging to identity or the illusion of superiority. Namsha, the elephant in the room. The historical link between Nietzsche's philosophy and the rise of Nazism cannot be ignored. The Buddha might address this by emphasizing the karmic consequences of ideas, much like actions. The Kalama Sutta, AN 3.65, could be particularly relevant, as it encourages critical examination of all ideas and teachings, warning against blindly following views without considering their ethical impact. To Nietzsche, the Buddha might pose this question: do you see how ideas, like actions, bear fruit? When morality is rejected without wisdom, what arises in its place? Without compassion, power becomes destruction. Without discipline, freedom becomes indulgence. Can the Übermensch bring peace, or does he carry the seeds of suffering? Frankl, Nietzsche, and the Buddha. In a three-way dialogue, the Buddha might offer Frankl and Nietzsche a unifying perspective. Frankl's search for meaning and Nietzsche's rejection of it both point to the same truth, that clinging, whether to purpose or power, inevitably leads to suffering. The Buddha could guide them toward the middle way, showing how wisdom, compassion, and morality are essential for liberation. The Buddha might conclude with, meaning can inspire and power can create, but without wisdom and morality, both become fuel for suffering. True freedom lies not in what you achieve or reject, but in letting go of all that binds you. This framework acknowledges their historical and philosophical weight while allowing the Buddha's teachings to shine through. How does this approach resonate with your vision?
Yeah, it illustrates the need for views to be exercised in a way where it's going to be harmless, and it shows that they are tools which, like power tools, if they're badly used, can cut you. So you've got to be very careful. In that case, Ucheda Ditti, the view of nihilism, which is included in the Brahmajala Sutta, Digha Nikaya 1. There's an extensive list of various kinds of views. So Nietzsche suffered, I think, from the nihilism view. Let's move on to the next two. Eugen Bleuler, the psychiatrist who founded ideas to do with schizophrenia, he created the term schizophrenia and autism, and then those got amended. But his student, Sigmund Freud, they worked both at the Kraepelin Institute, I believe that was, and Sigmund Freud, influential psychoanalyst. So out of his work there, he derived many of his core views to do with the repression and suppression of sexual drives into the subconscious formulative years. So what would conversation do you imagine that would be like, where there was Eugen Bleuler with his great beard meeting the Buddha, and Sigmund Freud, his young student, meeting the Buddha?
This next pairing, Eugen Bleuler, the psychiatrist who shaped our understanding of schizophrenia and autism, and Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, creates a fascinating conversation with the Buddha, particularly around the mind, mental health, and the origins of suffering. Their focus on the inner workings of the mind contrasts intriguingly with the Buddha's deep insights into mental formations and liberation from suffering. Eugen Bleuler and the Buddha Bleuler's work on schizophrenia and autism opened up the exploration of fragmented perceptions of reality. The Buddha might engage with Bleuler by discussing how the mind can become entangled in delusions, moha, and how mental disorders reflect suffering caused by disconnection from reality. While Bleuler approached these issues through science, the Buddha might point to the Satipatthana Sutta, MN10, which offers a framework for observing and understanding mental states with mindfulness. The Buddha might say to Bleuler, "Bleuler, you have studied the mind's fragmentation, but have you observed your own? Is there a self behind the thoughts, the delusions, and the perceptions you see in others? Mental suffering arises from clinging to these constructs. Understanding the mind is not enough. Freedom lies in letting go." This could invite Bleuler to consider how mindfulness and meditation might complement his scientific approach, offering not just diagnosis, but a pathway to liberation. Sigmund Freud and the Buddha. Freud's theories of repression and the subconscious might resonate with the Buddha's teaching on mental formations, sankharas, and how unwholesome tendencies arise and condition behavior. However, Freud's focus on sexual drives as central to the psyche could be a point of contention, as the Buddha would likely see this as one form of craving, kamatanha, among many. The Buddha might say to Freud, "Freud, you have uncovered how past experiences shape the present, but do you see how clinging to desire and aversion perpetuates this suffering? Beyond the subconscious lies the root, craving and ignorance. Can you see the mind not as layers to uncover, but as conditions to release?" The Siddha Sutta, SN 41.7, which explores how the mind can be purified by understanding and uprooting defilements, could be a key teaching for Freud. It might challenge him to look beyond the subconscious to the deeper patterns of craving and ignorance that drive human behavior. The conversation between Bleuler, Freud, and the Buddha. If Bleuler and Freud meet the Buddha together, the dynamic might center around the causes of mental suffering and the nature of the mind. Bleuler's focus on observable disorders and Freud's exploration of internal drives could be reframed by the Buddha in terms of dependent origination, paticca samuppada. The Buddha could explain how mental suffering arises not just from biological or subconscious factors, but from the interplay of ignorance, craving, and clinging. The Buddha might say, "Bleuler, you see the outward disintegration of the mind. Freud, you explore the hidden currents beneath. Both are conditioned phenomena, but have you seen the origin of suffering? Ignorance feeds craving Craving feeds becoming, and becoming feeds suffering. To untangle the mind, one must understand this chain and let it cease. A teaching like the Upanisa Sutta, SN 1223, could be powerful here, as it links mental phenomena to liberation, showing how conditions can be transformed rather than merely analyzed. Berstadt, the ethical implications. Freud's focus on repression and sexuality could lead the Buddha to question the ethical dimensions of his methods. The Buddha might remind Freud that liberation is not about indulgence or suppression, but about balance and wisdom. Perhaps drawing on the Kandaraka Sutta, MN 51, where the Buddha discusses how mindfulness leads to mastery over desires rather than being ruled by them. Meanwhile, Bleuler's scientific objectivity might be enriched by a conversation on compassion and interdependence, as found in the Metta Sutta, Sen 1.8. The Buddha might encourage Bleuler to see mental health not just as a clinical issue, but as an opportunity to foster deeper understanding and kindness. How does this structure feel for their dialogue? It seems like their shared focus on the mind creates space for both contrast and complementarity with the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, not only the diagnosis, but also the practice that they were advocating. I noticed that with Bleuler, when he observed Charles Mesmer of practicing what he was practicing, which was a sort of pseudo-scientific approach to animal magnetism, he was putting people in a trance. He became very interested in the idea of trance and didn't want to risk his reputation, but encouraged Freud to continue to look into the idea of hypnosis. And this led to the talking therapy, the couch, the suggestion, the lulling down into a sort of semi-dream-like hypnagogic sort of state. And he became very interested in the results of that. So that was kind of a form of, we could call it a form of meditation, but it's sort of is and sort of isn't. You're dependent on the hypnotherapist. And he was also they were both working largely with people who had some sort of mental disorder, and then for inferring the model of the mind from that, whereas the Buddha didn't advocate his monks to go working in a psychiatric ward. He was working with fairly well-balanced people and then educating them about the five aggregates and about the dependent origination is quite difficult to understand even for educated people. So quite a bit of a difference of aim and direction. Shall we move on then? Next to J. Krishnamurti and Master Taixu, the Chinese reformer. Krishnamurti, the teacher.
You've brought up a really important distinction, the difference in both the aims and methods of Freud and Bleuler versus the Buddha. Their work, rooted in external techniques like hypnosis and talking therapy for mental disorders, contrasts sharply with the Buddha's focus on self-reliance, direct insight, and the cultivation of wisdom in already balanced individuals. It highlights how their practices serve different purposes. Freud and Bleuler aiming to treat psychological imbalances, while the Buddha sought to liberate all beings from samsara. The parallel between hypnosis and meditation is also thought-provoking, as it illustrates how altered states of mind can be used either for dependency, as in relying on a therapist, or for cultivating mindfulness and wisdom, as the Buddha taught. That said, the Buddha might have pointed out the limitations of Freud and Bleuler's approaches, as they largely aimed to fix the mind without transcending it. Now, where shall we go next? Let's continue with the next intriguing pair.
J. Krishnamurti, the teacher who was against organized religion and only emphasizing on self-realization and through direct insights, and Master Taixu, who was at the beginning of the 20th century in China, wishing to largely dissemble many of the over-full monasteries, which were emphasizing on superstitious practices and garnering lots of support because of funeral rites and chantings. He saw that as no good, that Master Taixu and Master Yinshun were involved. And it was also at the rise of the People's Movement, the People's Power Movement, which sought to dismember lots of, well, people, but also dismember lots of established things that were empiricized, they're empirical sort of styles of power structures, and to remove them. But the monasteries were looking largely kind of like palaces around that time as well. So Master Taixu fled when that all happened, because Marxism aims to destroy religion. So they fled to Taiwan. So yeah, Krishnamurti and Master Taixu both engaged in organized religion in a counterpoint kind
This
of a
pairing
way.
of J. Krishnamurti, who rejected organized religion in
Interesting that the
favor of
Buddha
self-realization,
setting it up,
and Master Taixu, who
also
sought to reform Chinese Buddhism by
dismantling
dismantling
Brahmanism.
superstition and institutional excess, offers a rich opportunity for dialogue with the Buddha. Both figures were, in their ways, rebels against established systems, yet their methods and contexts differ profoundly. J. Krishnamurti and the Buddha. Krishnamurti's emphasis on direct insight and rejection of dogma aligns in some ways with the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha often encouraged individuals to test his teachings against their own experience, as seen in the Kalama Sutta, AN 3.65. However, Krishnamurti's complete dismissal of any structure or path might draw a challenge from the Buddha, who outlined the Eightfold Path as a practical framework for liberation. The Buddha might say to Krishnamurti, "Krishnamurti, you teach direct insight, and this is good. But without a path, how does one who is lost find their way? Is freedom not more accessible when guided by skillful means? Even direct insight arises from effort and mindfulness. Consider the middle way, not clinging to systems, but not rejecting them entirely either." This could lead to a dialogue about the balance between freedom from dogma and the necessity of a guiding framework.
Yeah, I agree
Master
with this.
Taixu and the Buddha. Master Taishu's critique of superstition and emphasis on humanistic Buddhism would likely resonate with the Buddha. His desire to reform monasteries aligns with the Buddha's own emphasis on simplicity and practice rather than ritual. However, Taishu's context, the pressures of Marxism and the collapse of traditional structures, adds a layer of complexity that the Buddha might address. The Buddha might say to Taishu, "Taishu, you see the harm of greed and superstition in the Sangha. This is wise, but how do you maintain the Dhamma when uprooting institutions? True reform must preserve wisdom and compassion while letting go of what binds. Can you hold fast to the Dhamma without clinging to the forms it takes?" The Cakkavatti Sihanada Sutta, DN 26,
Cakkavatti
which
Sihanada.
discusses righteous leadership and the balance of governance and morality, might serve as a foundation for this discussion. The conversation between Krishnamurti, Taixu, and the Buddha. Together, the dialogue could explore the tension between freedom and structure, tradition and reform, and the risks of discarding too much or clinging to what no longer serves. Krishnamurti's radical individualism might challenge Taishu's reformist goals, while Taishu's commitment to institutional reform might highlight the gaps in Krishnamurti's rejection of all frameworks. The Buddha might guide them both by saying, "Krishnamurti, freedom is essential, but without a path, the mind easily wanders into confusion. Taishu, reform is necessary, but beware of destroying the roots while cutting the branches. The middle way balances the need for change with the wisdom of preservation. Can freedom and reform work together to uplift all beings?" Sutta reflections. The Vatthupama Sutta, MN7, might be
Vatthupama.
particularly useful in this context, addressing the stains of pride, attachment, and delusion that arise in both individual and institutional contexts. For Krishnamurti, this could illuminate the danger of becoming attached to the idea of rejecting all systems. For Taishu, it might highlight the risks of clinging to reform for its own sake without maintaining the essence of the Dhamma. This pairing creates a fertile ground for exploring the interplay between radical freedom, institutional responsibility, and the middle way. Shall we move to the next pair? Or do you want to unpack this one
is the
further?
final pair, isn't it? This is the final pair, actually. Just to point out the different, one of the differences, contrast between Master Taixu and Krishnamurti, as in his contrast with Master Yinshun. Master Yinshun really wanted only the dependent origination, as taught in Tibet by one of the masters there way back. He wanted to revitalize it, kind of old wine in new bottles. And what happened there was a conflict of ideas. Was that Master Taixu said we should keep in the realms, we should keep in the angelic and the heavenly realms and the hell realms and so on, whereas Master Yin-Shu said no, we should just have this present moment, dependent origination teaching. I believe that's right, which is a bit like Krishnamurti's. Krishnamurti was so against anything conceptual or religious that he only wanted this sort of present moment, here and now is all there is sort of thing, and that's your awakening. No thought, just is, just being with what was right there, but no organization. He was heavily influenced by his experience as a child, where he was nominated to be the sort of savior of an organization which created for him. So that's I think that brings us to the end of our list 46 for today's new format, which is more in discussion also with AI, which is a new experiment. I'm always into innovating and ways to bring out the meanings of the teaching in refreshing kind of ways, and chew it around, discuss it without doing any harm. Take care. May many beings be free from suffering and avoidable stress.
Thank you for sharing this fascinating and thought-provoking journey through your experiment with List 46. The contrasts you've highlighted, particularly between Krishnamurti's present moment emphasis and Master Taishu's inclusion of cosmological elements, bring out a deeply significant tension in how teachings are adapted and transmitted across time and context. This exploration has been a fantastic way to engage with these figures and their philosophies while weaving in the Buddha's timeless teachings. Your point about Krishnamurti's rejection of conceptual and organizational structures aligns with his deep disillusionment from his childhood experience. It's almost as though his path is a counter-reaction, where the Buddha might point to balance rather than outright rejection. Similarly, Master Taishu's willingness to retain the cosmological elements could reflect a more integrative approach, but it also risks maintaining attachments that might not serve liberation. Reflecting on the experiment. This new format of discussing the list feels incredibly alive and creative. By diving into these dialogues, you've brought out nuanced contrasts, parallels, and opportunities for reflection that might have been lost in a more static format. It's a way of keeping the Buddha's teachings dynamic and engaging, rather than merely reciting them. If this has been a fruitful method for you, it sounds like a format worth continuing. Perhaps the next step could be experimenting with imagined dialogues, writing out how these figures might interact with the Buddha in real-time exchanges. Or even grouping some of the individuals into thematic clusters for larger conversations. Would you like to reflect on how this experiment has shifted your understanding or brought out new insights? Or are you ready to brainstorm what's next?
Well, just to review and summarize in a way, liberation, liberty, these definitely come through. The themes of freedom. In terms of General Nasser, it's freedom from oppression from colonial powers. That's the idea of it, via superego, us, our, and so on, which frequently happens with globalized systems, like the very large colonial powers that were occupying and using the area. And then the Stanley Clarke, the liberty and the liberation of the heart and mind through musical talent, speed and beauty, dexterity. Does it really liberate the heart and mind, or does it trap you in a monster of your own making, in a way? And then Douglas Bader, the liberation and the liberty of protection.
That's a beautiful summary, tying together the themes of liberation and freedom that weave through your thought experiment. Let's review these ideas with that lens of liberation and how each figure interacts with it. General Nasser. Liberation as freedom from oppression. Nasser's pursuit of freedom from colonial powers reflects a collective struggle for external liberty, rooted in sovereignty and national identity. The Buddha might challenge whether such freedom, tied to power and territory, truly liberates the heart and mind, or simply replaces one form of clinging with another. True liberation, as the Buddha teaches, goes beyond political or social systems. It is the freedom from craving and attachment. Liberation through talent and expression. Stanley Clarke's extraordinary musical talent represents another kind of liberation, freedom of creative expression and mastery of skill. Yet, as you say, the question remains, does this kind of freedom truly liberate, or does it become a trap of kama tanha, sensual craving, and ego? The Buddha's teachings might suggest that while such expression can be uplifting, without mindfulness and balance, it risks becoming a gilded cage, tethering one to worldly attachments. Freedom across the list. As we moved through the other figures, these themes of liberty and liberation emerged in varied forms. Douglas Bader exemplifies freedom through resilience, overcoming physical limitations but risking pride and ego as his source of motivation. The Buddha might guide him toward humility and true inner liberation. The Bennets, caught in their societal roles, represent the struggle for freedom from the cycles of pride, prejudice, and social climbing. Viktor Frankl and Friedrich Nietzsche show us contrasting paths. Frankl finds freedom in meaning despite unimaginable suffering, while Nietzsche rejects morality in favor of a will to power that arguably enslaves him further. The Buddha might steer both toward a middle way, free from clinging to either extreme. Bleuler and Freud seek freedom from mental suffering, yet their methods, hypnosis, psychoanalysis, could risk fostering dependency rather than self-reliance. The Buddha's approach to mental liberation through mindfulness and
direct seeing. I'm just going to say that. Okay, let's carry on. So yeah, Bleuler and Free. So what else was there? The Buddha's approach to mental liberation through mindfulness and direct insight stands in stark contrast. Krishnamurti rejects structures entirely, seeking liberation in the present moment, while Master Taixu balances reform with tradition and seeking freedom for Buddhism itself, which is a bit different. And then both paths raise questions about how much to hold on to and how much to let go. Liberation in the Buddha's teachings, throughout the Buddha's perspective, offers a consistent reminder. True liberation lies beyond the external, beyond talent, power, meaning, or societal reform. It is the release from craving, clinging, and the illusions of self. The Eightfold Path offers a structured yet flexible way to navigate those challenges without being trapped by them. This experiment has beautifully illustrated the many layers and nuances of what liberation means across different contexts. How do you feel this exploration has shaped or deepened your understanding of freedom and the Buddha's teachings? Let us know in the comments. Take care and look forward to our next session together.